Dayan Hool's much missed father, who was the Rav of Kingsbury for so many years and basically revolutionized London. Dayan Hool has come and also revolutionized London in a different way around. He has been a Dayan on the Federation for about 10 years, time flies, having been previously a Dayan in Yerushalayim and a prestigious Beis Din for also 10 years, and also an arbitrator of repute, a commercial qualified arbitrator. Dayan Hool has brought a wonderful expertise to London and has settled countless Dinei Torah with, I believe, many times smiling faces on both sides, which is in itself quite an achievement to do because of Dayan Hool's professionalism. We're very delighted that Dayan Hool is coming and giving a shir tonight. Very interesting title, one which is often missed, the Arba Imos, how they picture. We've got lots of different Albas in the Seder, but I think we've never heard a shir on the Arba Imos. Many shiurim on the other Albas, the other fours, but the Arba Imos I think is something very unique and not surprising because Dayan Hool doesn't always go down the normal path. This shir is learned Leilu Nishmas Yocheved Bas Avrom, dear lamented Jacqueline Curzon, who remembered Midei Chodesh B'Chodshei, is brought under auspices of the EAYC with Daniel Gillis and Shlomi Goldmeyer, making sure that the shir happens each month. So, very delighted to introduce Dayan Hool, who will tell us and explain something which probably we don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Good evening. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to come here and speak to you all. And it's a pleasure to be involved in these monthly shiurim. There are three matzahs, as we all know, the Seder table and the Seder plate. And the halachic reason behind that is because you need to have two whole matzahs for a lechem mishnah, like you have two breads every time you make kiddush on Yom Tov, on Shabbos. But also the Torah tells us that we need to have lechem oini, a poor man's bread. So we need to have a bread which is not whole. So in order to fulfill all the opinions, we have three matzahs, two which we remain whole throughout the Seder, and one which we break in the middle to be the lechem oini, the poor man's bread. And there are other remozim allusions from these the three matzahs. One of them is that some say it's Keneged Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They correspond the three matzahs to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the three forefathers. And the simple idea being that even though we were slaves to Paro in Mitzrayim, but nonetheless we were miyuchas, we had ancestors who were illustrious. We were the children and descendants of the Gedolei Olam, the great people of previous generations, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. There's another idea behind it, which the Rosh brings down. The Rosh was a Rishon, and he writes that Hashem told Avraham Avinu that your children will go down to Mitzrayim, your descendants will go down to Mitzrayim, and they'll be there for 400 years. As we know, in the event, they're only actually there for 210 years, so 190 years less. So the Rosh says that there's an idea behind this. He says that I've heard a medrash. The medrash says that when the Jews were in Mitzrayim and the forefathers in Shemayim in heaven were davening for them, so Hashem said to the Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, is there any one of you which was willing to change a letter of your name in order to reduce the amount of time that the Jews have to be in Mitzrayim? And Avraham and Yaakov said not, we can't afford to lose a letter of the name. But Yitzchak said that I'm prepared to change the letter of my name, because Yitzchak means he shall laugh, he shall be happy. And it can also be spelled with a sin, Yitzchak. And in fact, the Divrei Yomim, we say, Asher Kosset Avraham Ushvuoso Yitzchak, and there it actually says it with a sin. So Yitzchak said, I'm prepared to change my name from Yitzchak with a sin to Yitzchak with a tzaddik. Now the difference between sin is a gematria of 300 and tzaddik is a gematria of 90. So the difference between the two is 210. So Yitzchak said, I'm prepared to spell my name Yitzchak rather than Yitzchak in order that the Jews should go out of Mitzrayim after 210 years rather than 400 years. And this says the Rosh is alluded to a pasuk in Yeshayahu, it's in Yeshayahu, Perek Shamach Gimel, pasuk Tez Zayin. Ki ata ovinu, ki Avram lo yodonu. Hashem is our father because Avram didn't know us. Yisrael lo yakironu. And Yisrael, which is Yaakov, also didn't recognize us. Ata Hashem ovinu go'aleinu me'olam shemecha. You Hashem are our father and you'll redeem us. The Pasuk in Yeshaya says that Avram and Yaakov, so to speak, didn't know us, but Yitzchok implied did know us. And the Rosh says this is alluded to in this idea that Yitzchok was willing to change the letters of his name in order to allow the Jews to come out of Mitzrayim after 210 years. But if that's the case, and if it's true that the three matzahs on the Seder plate correspond to Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov, well, maybe there's a remiz there, an allusion that when we take the middle matzah and we split it, because the middle matzah represents Yitzchok, and Yitzchok split the 400 into 210, so it's almost half. One's a slightly bigger, one's slightly smaller, and the bigger half we put aside for the Afikomen, which is a remnant to the 210 years that we were in Mitzrayim. So, at any rate, the three matzahs allude to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But if that's the case, then where do we find the four mothers, the Arba Imos, Sorah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah? Where are they alluded to in the Seder? So there's a Maharal in Kavod Hashem Perek Samach, and he says that the Arba Kosos, the 4 cups of wine that we drink, are allusion to the four mothers, to Sorah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And he says that, in particular, the Pasuk in Tehillim refers to a wife as a fruitful vine. Your wife is like a fruitful vine on the walls of the house. And therefore, he says, when we're talking about the Arba Himolos, they're alluded to by the 4 cups of wine. When we say Bori Priagofen, it's a remiss to the schus of the Arba Himolos. And the walls of your house is an allusion to the fact that they were tsunuos, they were particularly modest, stayed inside the home most of the time. And we were meramis to that when we have the 4 cups of wine. And the Shloah Kodesh, interestingly enough, the Shloah Kodesh lived at the same time as the Maharal, also says the same thing. He also says that the 4 kosas alludes to the 4 imos, the Arba imos, the Sorah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. So I want to explore a little bit this idea. If it's true that the 4 cups of wine correspond to the Arba imos, then we would expect that the first cup of wine to allude in some way to Sorah, and the second one to Rivka, and the third one to Rachel, and the last one to Leah. So let's look at some Midrashim and some fascinating Divrei Chazal and see if we can see some of the depth behind this idea that the Shloah and the Maharal say about the fact that the 4 cups of wine allude to the Arba Himos. So first of all, we have a Midrash, Tona de Beliohu in Perek Kaf Zayin, and there it brings a posuk, the posuk in Tehillim Perek Samach, Elohim Moshe Yechidim Beisor, Motzi Asirim B'Kosharos. Hashem takes individuals and creates from them a home, and he takes out prisoners who are in chains. Now, Chazal Darshan in other places in the Gemara, Motzi Asirim B'Kosharos can also refer to Yetzias Mitzrayim. And the idea is that Hashem took out prisoners, which was Klal Yisrael in Mitzrayim, but Koshoros, there the Gemara darshans it to mean in a suitable time, in a particularly opportune time. And Chazal say it was a time in the spring when it wasn't too rainy and it wasn't too hot. That was the ideal time to trek outside Mitzrayim. Hashem took us out dafka then. But fascinating, the first part of the passage, which connects to this, says, Elokim Moshe Yechidim Beisor. Hashem creates homes. He takes individuals, takes singles, and he makes homes and houses for them. Remember the idea that Hashem is mazavek zivukim, he makes shidduchim. And the Tona de Beliohu says that Hashem took Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim, and he only did it because Ela b'shvil Sorah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and the schus of Sorah and Rivka and Rachel and Leah. And he goes through, and Tona de Beliohu says each one of them had an individual schus. Fascinating. All to do with shidduchim. He says Sorah took Hagar, who is a single lady, and she married her off to Avram, which was actually her husband. And Rachel did the same thing with Bilhah. She took her Shifcha, Bilhah, and she married her off to her husband Yaakov. And Leah took Zilpah and married her off to Yaakov. And Rivka, although she didn't actually marry anybody else off to her husband, but nonetheless, Rivka also has a particular source of shidduchim, because when Rivka was asked by Eliezer, by Lavan, will you go with Eliezer? And she said, yes, I will go. In the schus that she gave her put a faith and a betochen in a Kodesh Baruch Hu, to leave her home and go off to marry Yitzchok. That was the schus that Klal Yisrael went out from Mitzrayim. The schus of the four mothers, three of them who made shidduchim, and one of them who married herself off. And dafka in that schus, Klal Yisrael came out of Mitzrayim. A remarkable idea. But now let's look a little bit more on the individuals, each one, and how they correspond to the various different cups of wine. So the first cup of wine on the Seder night is the Kiddush. When we make Kiddush on Yom Tov, and we say, Hashem Hashem chose us from all of the people. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu raised us up above every other language. And he was Mekadosh us. He gave us holiness and Kedusha. We were chosen out of all the other people. So straight away we see already an idea that we can connect to Sorah. Because Avraham Avinu was the first person who spread Hashem's name in the world. And we know Chazal tell us that Avraham was Megaiah the men and Sorah was Megaiah the women. Avraham made the men into Gerim and Sorah was Megeres es Hanoshim. She Giro es Hanoshim. And therefore she brought people, Tachas Kanfei Shechina, into the Jewish people and was Mekadosh them. And therefore it's appropriate that she is connected the concept of Kiddush. But it goes a lot deeper than that. When Avraham went down to Mitzrayim because there was a famine in Eretz Yisrael. No sooner had he arrived to Eretz Yisrael from Choron than there was a famine and he had to go down to Mitzrayim. As they approached Mitzrayim, the Pasuk tells us that he says to Sarah, please tell them that you're my sister. Because if you don't tell them you're sister, you tell them you're my wife, then Sarah, being particularly beautiful, the Egyptians will want to take her, and they will kill me and take you as a wife. So don't tell them that you're my wife, and then they won't kill me. And that's what happened. They came down to Mitzrayim. Sarah said that Avraham was her brother, and the officers there saw how beautiful Sarah was, and they took her to Paro. In the event, Paro wanted to marry her. But what happened was, as the Pasuk tells us, that at night Paro wasn't able to go anywhere near her. On the contrary, Paro was smitten by a Nagoim Gedolim, the Pasuk says, by a Naga Hashem es Paro Nagoim Gedolim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu plagued Paro with all sorts of plagues. And the next day, Paro said to Avraham, why didn't you tell me that it was your wife? And he told them to leave in peace, and not only told them to leave in peace, but he gave them a huge amount of riches. So the Medrash in Pirkei Rebbe Eliezer says that the night that Sarah was taken to Paro was actually the night of Pesach. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought Nagoim Gedolim on Paro and his household. Just like in the future, Klal Yisrael were going to go down to Mitzrayim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was going to bring Nagoim Gedolim, the 10 Makkos, which the Torah calls Od Nega Echod, also Oviam al Paro. Hashem calls the Makkos a Nega, a plague. And it was all Masa Ovasim and Nabonim. Whatever happened to Avraham happened to his descendants. So the Yidden went down to Mitzrayim. They were also captured by Mitzrayim, but eventually HaKadosh Baruch Hu first of all plagued the Mitzrayim and then redeemed them and sent them out. And they went out with great wealth and with great riches. So too, Paro sent away Sarah. He gave her kesef and zov, gold and silver, servants, land, and actually the Medrash says he gave her the land of Goshen as well. He gave her the land of area in Mitzrayim, which was called Goshen. And we know that many years later, when the Jews went down to Mitzrayim, in the times of Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim went down to Mitzrayim, they all settled in the land of Goshen. And it wasn't for nothing they went to the land of Goshen, because the land of Goshen, Sarah had already received as a present from Paro, and therefore it belonged to her descendants. Now here we have a very interesting question. Avraham was concerned that they might kill him and take Sarah. So he said to Sarah, please say that you're my you're my sister, not rather than my husband, rather than my wife, in order they shouldn't kill me. So Avram was saved, but Sarah wasn't. Sarah was actually captured and kidnapped and taken to Paro. Why wasn't Avram concerned about Sarah, that anything would happen to her? He'd saved himself, but what about Sarah? And there can only be one answer. And the answer is that Avram didn't worry about Sarah because he knew that nothing was going to happen to Sarah. Sarah was the greatest woman that ever lived. She was greater than Avram in Nevuah. Chazal said in prophecy, she was greater than Avram. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Avram, whatever Sarah tells you, you listen to her. So Avram wasn't worried that anything would happen to Sarah. He was worried that something might happen to him. But he didn't have a concern for Sarah because he knew in her state of Kedusha, in her state of holiness and purity, no one would be able to touch her. And he was right. That's exactly what happened. Paro couldn't get anywhere near her. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished Paro. And the Chazal tell us that Sarah stood there and she said to the Malach, smite him, and the Malach smote Paro. At her command, at Sarah's command. So Sarah was taken care of. Avram was concerned for himself, but he wasn't concerned for Sarah, because Sarah was greater than him. The Medrash Rabbah tells us in Vayikra Pasha Lamed Beis that Sarah went down to Mitzrayim and she fenced herself off from any immorality. Godra atzmo min ha'ervo. And says the Medrash something fascinating. V'nigdaru kol hanoshim biskusa. All the women in Klal Yisrael were completely fenced off from any arroyos when they went down to Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was the worst country in the world. It was the worst country in the world for sexual immorality. All of the Jewish women who were in Mitzrayim for 210 years, the Medrash says not one of them was touched by a single Mitzri. When I say not one, the Medrash says there was one exception. At the end of Parshas Emor, the Torah tells us there was one woman whose name was Shlemis Bas Divri, and she had a child from an Egyptian man. Says the Medrash, Achas Hoysel personal Kosov. There was only one woman in 210 years who had anything to do with an Egyptian man, and she was called Shlemis Bas Divri. And Chazal tell us the reason why she got involved with an Egyptian man is because she was too friendly to people. She was called Shlemis because she said shalom to everybody, shalom, shalom to you, passers by she'd open up conversations with. She ended up having a child from an Egyptian. But no other Jewish woman was touched throughout the whole time that Klal Yisrael were in Mitzrayim. And the Chazal tell us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu put his name on Klal Yisrael in Parshas Pinchas. It lists all the families of Klal Yisrael who are in the Midbar, and it says lechanoch lemishpachas hachanochi, lepalo lemishpachas hapalui. Every name, every family name in Klal Yisrael, Hashem added a hey at the beginning and a yud at the end, which is Hashem's name, yud and hey, to testify that every one of them was meyuchas, all of them, their genealogy was pure, they weren't touched by a Mitzri. How could that be that the Mitzrim completely ruled over their bodies and forced them to do forced labor, but nonetheless were not able to touch any of the women? Says the Medrash Rabbah Vayikra, because Sarah went down to Mitzrayim, and she was Godra Atzma and Erva. In her zchus, that she was so holy and so pure that Pharaoh couldn't touch her, she made an influence in Egypt. She made a hashpah in Egypt that no Jewish woman could be defiled or touched by any Mitzri throughout the 210 years that they were there. And if that's the case, we can look at another Medrash in Vayikra and Parsha Kaf Daled. The Medrash says, why is the Parsha of Arayos juxtaposed to the Parsha of Kedoshim of being holy? To teach you that whenever you find a Geder Ervel, wherever you find people keeping themselves well away from Gilei Arayos, from immorality, Ato Moitze Kedusha. That's where you find Kedusha, that's when you find holiness. And it goes together. Kol mishu goder atzmim eno ervo nikra kodesh, says the Medrash. Whoever keeps himself well away from immorality, he is called holy. That is the definition of Kedusha. If that's the definition of Kedusha, of holiness, then we well understand that when we take the first cup of wine and we make Kiddush, and we said, Asher Kiddush shonu b'mitzvosav, HaKadosh Baruch Hu made us Kodesh, he made us holy, and he separated us, B'charbon mikol ha'amim. He chose us from all other nations of the world. We understand that that first cup of wine corresponds to Sori Menu, the woman who with her tznius and with her Kedusha and with her Tara laid the foundations for the Kedusha of Klal Yisrael and laid the foundations for what would be afterwards the Yetzias Mitzrayim, when Klal Yisrael came out as a special nation, untouched by the Mitzrayim and completely holy. The second cup of wine, we understand, must correspond to Rivka. The second cup of wine is made over the Haggadah. The Haggadah is actually the telling of the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. As we mentioned earlier, the Tonin de Belial says in the Schus that Rivka says, I will go with Eliezer to go and marry Yitzchak from a foreign land. In that merit, HaKadosh Baruch Hu took Klal Yisrael out of Mitzrayim and brought them to Eretz Yisrael, just like Rivka went from Eretz Tumah to Eretz Kedusha. But there's more to it than that as well. The Pasuk says that Yaakov, that Yitzchak wanted to give brachos to his son. He wanted to give the brachos to Esav. Rivka heard about it and decided that it's not appropriate for the brachos to go to Esav. They need to go to Yaakov. So she called Yaakov and she said to him, you need to go and take the brachos. So the Pirkei Rebbe Eliezer says, when was this? Says the Pirkei Rebbe Eliezer, this was Pesach night. Rivka said to Yaakov, Bani, my son, halaylo hazeh, this night, oitzores talalim niftochim, the storehouses of dew are opened up. That means the bracha, which is stored up in Shemayim, is opened up on the night of Pesach, which incidentally is why we say Tfilas Tal on the first day Pesach. Halaylo hazeh, says Rivka, ha'elyonim omrim shira. Tonight is the night of Pesach, when in Shemayim they're singing shira. And therefore, now, she says to Yaakov, now is the time to go and bring mat'amim, tasty food for your father, in order that he should eat, and he should be able to be b'simcha, with joy, and he will give you a bracha. Yaakov was concerned that Yitzchak would find out that he wasn't Esav, he was Yaakov, and she said to him, don't worry about it, or like it, loskavani. And says the Pasuk, she went and prepared for him 2 gediyah, 2 small kid goats. Says the Medrash, and Rashi quotes it in the Pasuk. Did Yitzchak need to eat 2 small kid goats? Is that what he normally ate? Says Rashi, B'Shem the Medrash, it was Pesach night, and he brought 2 kid goats, one for mat'amim, or one for chagiga, for the food which you eat at the beginning of the Suda, and one for the Korban Pesach, which has to be eaten al asova only once you've already eaten your main meal. You have to eat your kazayas of Korban Pesach. And therefore, Rivka made dafka 2 gediyah, one for chagiga matamim and one for the Korban Pesach. And perhaps, again, as we mentioned earlier, if it's in the schus of Yitzchak that we left after 210 years, it's particularly appropriate that he waited till Seder night to give the brachos over. And now we find something really fascinating. The Maharil Diskinu, Shur Leib Diskinu, was the Rav of Yerushalayim going back about 130 years ago. He says, if Rashi tells us that she prepared 2 gediyah, one for Pesach and one for Chagiga, then we can also understand why the Pasuk goes on to say, she gave the tasty food, and she gave him some bread as well. What was the lechem? It was matzah, lechem oini, because it was Seder night. Says the Pasuk, Vayover lo yayin vayesht. Yaakov brought for Yitzchak wine as well. Why did he bring wine? Because it was Seder night. You had to have 4 cups of wine. Carries on with Shur Leib Diskin, and he says, Yaakov ate from that. He gave the brachos to Yitzchak he gave the brachos to Yaakov. Yaakov went out, and then Esav came in. And Esav says, come, my father, and eat. And Yitzchak said, I've already given the brachos to somebody else. And Esav says, why can't you give me a bracha as well? Says Shur Leib Diskin, he couldn't give a bracha because Yitzchak had said, I'm only able to give a bracha if you bring me food. Yaakov had brought me food. I can give a bracha. You've now brought me food, but I can't eat it. Why can't I eat it? Because I've eaten afikomen already. And after I've eaten afikomen, I'm not able to eat anymore, and therefore I can't give you a bracha. So says Shur Leib Diskin. Comes along his Talmud, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, And he says something brilliant. Yitzchak said to Esav, Bo achicha b'mirmo, your brother came with trickery, and he took your bechorah, he took your bracha. What was the b'mirmo? What was the trickery? Says Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, the trickery was that he gave him afikomen, and therefore Esav would not be able to receive any brachos because Yitzchak wouldn't be able to eat anymore. Says Yosef Chaim, b'mirmo is gematria afikomen. It's the same gematria. It's a remez that the b'mirmo was that he gave him afikomen. So we see that the first ever person who made a Seder night that we have in recorded history was Rivka Imenu, who made matzahs. She made Korban Pesach and Korban Chagiga, or Zeicha to Pesach and Chagiga, and she made wine, 4 cups of wine, to give that Yaakov should receive the brachas on Seder night. And therefore it's particularly appropriate that the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim in the schus of Rivka, who left her parents' home to come to Eretz Yisrael and to marry Yitzchak, should correspond to the second cup of wine, the cup of wine which corresponds to Rivka Imenu. The third cup of wine is on benching, on Birchas Hamazon, and that would appear to be Keneged Rochel, corresponding to Rochel Imenu. So the Shloah Kodesh already says that the third cup of wine corresponds to Rochel Imenu because her son was Yosef, and Yosef was the one who fed all of Klal Yisrael when they went down to Egypt. And therefore it's appropriate when we say Birchas Hamazon to remember Rochel. And more than that, Rochel was the Akeres Habayis, the mainstay of the home. That's a pasuk in Tehillim, Moshiv Akeres Habayis. But Rashi uses that expression. When Yaakov decided to go back home, he called his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, to the field, and he told them it's time to go home, and Hashem has told me we need to go back to Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi notes, Shem Chazal, that he called Rachel and Leah, although Leah was married first, and Leah was older, but he called Rachel and Leah. Why Leah first? Why Rachel before Leah? Because Rachel is Akeres Habayis. She was the mainstay of the home. Yaakov intended to marry her, so she was, so to speak, the mainstay of the home. In fact, we find, Chazal tell us, that even Leah's descendants agreed that Rachel was the mainstay of the home. We find that at the end of Megillas Rus, when the women in Shevet Yehuda, in Beis Lechem, which was in Yehuda, the pasuk tells us, they said, this woman should be, they said to Naomi, Rus should be, Kerochel or Kalea asher bonishtem Space Yisrael, like Rachel and Leah, who both built up the house of Klal Yisrael. They said Rachel before Leah, even though they came from Yehuda, Yehuda came from Leah. They also agreed that Rachel was the Akeres Habayis, the mainstay of the home. Now, if you've heard my recent podcast, you would know that the Gemara in Bab Metzia Azov says, Ein brocha metzuya b'beisa shel Adam ela b'shvil ishtay. Brocha only comes into a person's house in the merit of his wife. Brocha in a house, blessing comes to a house through the wife, not through the husband, only through the wife. More than that, the Gemara in Bab Metzia Daf Nun Tes says, a person always must be careful with respecting and honoring his wife. La'olam yehi adam zohir b'chved ishto. Why? She'ein brocha metzuya b'veisei shel adam ela b'shvil ishto. Because if you want brocha to come in your house, you have to look after your wife, you have to respect her, and you have to honor her. And the Gemara goes on to say that Rava said to the Bnei Mechuzah, the people of Mechuzah, which was the town where Rava was the Rav, Rava, the great Amoris, says, honor your wives if you want to become wealthy. That's a school of becoming wealthy, is to look after your wife and honor her and respect her. And if that's the case, then we can look at the Sefer Teres Chaim on that Gemara in Bab Metzia. And the Gemara says there's a number of halachas when it comes to Kos Shel Birchas Hamazon. When you bench, you make a bracha on the cup of wine when you bench. And one of the 10 things on the halachas is that you're supposed to send it to the Gemara. Lashon the Gemara is le'in shebeisa b'matana. You're supposed to send it to the wife. The wife should drink from the Kos Shel Bracha. And the reason is in order that the house should be blessed. So the Teres Chaim explains that someone who benches Birchas Hamazon with a cup of wine brings shefa bracha elyona, a great abundance of bracha, of blessing down from Shemayim. and the house is blessed. But since bracha comes through the wife, and therefore there's an inyan to give the wife to drink from the kosher bracha, in order that the bracha should come down through her to the rest of the house. Just like when the Kohanim give a bracha in shul, the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, "Vani avorachem," I will bless the Kohanim, and once the Kohanim are blessed, they are able to transmit bracha further from Shemayim to everybody else. So too, the kosher bracha, which is given to the wife, helps to bring down the bracha through the wife to the rest of the household. And if that's the case, then we can understand why, if Rochel is the Akeres Habayis, Rochel is known as the ideal wife, the mainstay of the home, then Rochel is Keneged, the kos, the third cup of wine of Birchas Hamazon, because the cup of wine of Birchas Hamazon brings down the bracha through the wife. There's actually more to it than that as well. There's a Gemara in Sota. The Gemara in Sota says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, "Ein noisnim kosel bracha levorech ela l'tov ayin." You only give the cup of wine from the kosel bracha from Birchas Hamazon. You give it only to someone who has a good eye. Shener mata posuk tov ayin hu yevorach. Someone who's got a good eye, he should be blessed. And we read that, says the Gemara, as tov ayin hu yevorech. Someone who has a good eye, he should be the one who says the bracha. So when you ask someone to bench, the Gemara says you give the kosher bracha to someone who's a tov ayin, someone who has a good eye, someone who is generous, the opposite of ra ayin, of ayin ra. It's someone who is generous and magnanimous and wants always to give to other people. There's an inyan to give them to bench tov ayin hu yevorach, hu yevorech. And the Maharal explains there, because someone who has a good eye and wants good for other people, bracha could come through him. Someone who has a bad eye, bracha can't go through him. Only through someone who has a good eye. And therefore, when you want to bring down bracha to the household, the kosher bracha, you give it to someone who has a good eye. Fascinatingly, the Shulchan Aruch brings this halacha down, particularly with regard to the Leil HaSeder, to Seder night. So Shulchan Aruch, Siman Taf Ayin Tes, the Shulchan Aruch says, "V'noagu," the custom is that although often you would give the guests to bench, but on Seder night, it's the Balabayas Mevorach Birchas Hamazon B'Leil HaPesach. It's Dafka, the owner of the house, the head of the household, he's the one who benches on kosher bracha on Seder night. And the reason is, says the Shulchan Aruch, Shenema Tov Ayin Hu Yevorach. And the person who heads the Seder, he's called a Tov Ayin, he's called someone who has a good eye, because he's invited everybody to his house for the Seder night, called Dichvin Yeseh V'Yechel. Whoever is needy, whoever is hungry should come in. And therefore, particularly on the night of Seder, there is an emphasis on this concept that the benching should be done by Tov Ayin Hu Yevorach, Hu Yevorech. Well, no. Do we have anybody greater, a bigger Tov Ayin, a bigger generous and magnanimous person, more than Rochel Imenu? Rochel Imenu, who was the paragon of Tov Ayin, who was supposed to have married Yaakov, but instead gave over the Simonim in order that Leah should marry Yaakov instead, was willing to give all of that up in order that her sister should be embarrassed. That is the greatest Tov Ayin there is, Bechlal, in the world. And therefore, how appropriate is it that Rochel should be the Tov Ayin Hu Yevorach, should correspond to the third cup of wine when it comes to Birchas Hamazon, particularly on the night of the Seder, when we remember and we commemorate people who are Tov Ayin. There's more to that than that, very briefly, because we're running out of time. The Torah tells us that when Yosef and Binyamin met after having been separated for many years, they cried on each other's necks. Rashi tells us that Yosef cried about the Beis HaMikdash, which was in the portion of Binyamin which was going to be destroyed, and Binyamin cried about Yosef that the Mishkan, which was based in Shiloh, which was in the portion of Yosef, was also going to be destroyed. We find that both Botei Mikdash and the Mishkan were all in either the portion of Yosef or the portion of Binyamin, which were both Rochel's portion. That's why Rochel, says the Sifrei Chacham, is called Akeres Habayis, the mainstay of the house, but a remiss to the Beis HaMikdash as well. And therefore, when we bench, and we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only for the food, but we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Eretz Yisrael, ala oretz v'ala mozen, and we say, Rachem no Hashem Elokeinu, have mercy al tir mishkan kvedecha on the Beis Hamikdash, rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, b'nei Yerushalayim, b'nei Barachim Yerushalayim, rebuild the Beis Hamikdash with mercy. That's the appropriate time to invoke the schus of Rachel Imeinu. And particularly because, as we know, the Medrash tells us that when Klal Yisrael went into Golus, and the Ovos and Moshe Rabbeinu all davened that they should interceded on behalf of Klal Yisrael, that they should be redeemed, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't listen to anybody until Rachel Imeinu stood up. And she says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, after what I did and how I gave over my husband to my sister, that she shouldn't be embarrassed. And that's chus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should remember Klal Yisrael, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you need no longer cry. Stop having tears. There will be a reward for the work that you've done. Klal Yisrael will come back to their borders. And that's how appropriate when we say B'nei Yerushalayim, and we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash in Berachos Hamazon, we invoke the schus of Rachel Imeinu Dafka. The last cup of wine is on the Hallel. When we say the Hallel, we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we give praise to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we invoke the schus of Leah Imeinu. The Chazal tell us, the Gemara says, that Mi Omar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum of Shimon ben Yochai, Mi Yom Shabara HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as from the day HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, Lo Haya Adam Shahodel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There was no one who thanked and praised HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ad Shebasar Leah, until Leah came along, and she said, Apam Odes Hashem. When her fourth son Yehuda was born, she says, now I praise and I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Chazal tell us that she knew that Yaakov would have 4 wives and he would have 12 sons, so each one should have had 3 children. Once she had a 4th child, Yehuda, which was an extra, more than her Jews, so to speak, she gave special thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Gemara, she was the first person in the history of the world, since HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, who gave her door to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who thanked HaKadosh Baruch Hu for everything that he had done for her. And therefore it's not surprising that from Leah and from Yehuda came David HaMelech, the Ne'im Zmiris Yisrael, the sweet singer of Shvachos, of praises and Shira to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who compiled the Tehillim, which is the ultimate Shira. All of that came from Leah because she said, Hapam Odes Hashem. The Medrash says more than that. The Medrash contrasts Leah with Rachel in that Leah, Tofsa Plachodah, she was the one who took for herself this concept of orally speaking out the Shvach HaKadosh Baruch Hu. From her came Yehuda, who said, Tzod Kamimeni. From her came David HaMelech, who said, Hoidu Lashem Kitov. From her came Doniel, who said, Elokah Avosim Mohuda Meshabech Hano. People who, the greatest people of Klal Yisrael, who praised HaKadosh Baruch Hu, all came from Leah. And therefore, when we say Hallel, we invoke the schus of Leah. Fascinatingly, the Chidar says that when we make a brach on Hallel, we don't on the Seder night, we make a brach at the end. But on Yom Tov and on Rosh Chodesh, we make a brach on the Hallel. Brach is bracha to Hashem, likroi es Hallel. That's the brach we make. So likroi es Hallel, the Rosh Tov is the first letter is Lamed, likroi, es is the Aleph, Hallel is Hey, it spells Leah. It's a remez that we have the whole concept of Hallel and the ideas of the schus of praising HaKadosh Baruch Hu and singing Shira to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the schus of the Leah, who was the first person to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu and give praises to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I have actually there's a little bit more to say, but I think I've already gone 10 minutes over time, so I don't want to push my luck. So thank you all for listening, and I hope there's some inspiration here, and you've got some thoughts to think over, and hopefully to remember the Seder night, and maybe say over some of this on Seder night. But to remember in the schus of the Arba, that's why we were taken out of Egypt in the schus of the Arba, in the schus that they made Shidduchim, and in the schus that they were Tova Ayin, they were beginners, they were always generous and magnanimous and wanting to do good for others, in the schus that They thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we sing Shira for everything HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done us till now. Mitzvah Hashem, and the schus of the tefillas of the immahos, just like the schus of the tefillas, the prayers of the immahos and the noshin tzidkonius in the times of Mitzrayim. We came out of Mitzrayim, and Mitzvah Hashem, and the schus of the noshin tzidkonius this time around as well. We should be zocheh to the Geula Shlema, and maybe even this year, Mitzvah Hashem, be able to have a Korban Pesach in Mitzrayim and be able to sing Shir Shvachos Yachadim Ul Kal Yisrael in the Geula Shlema b'Meheira.
Wow. In fact, I'm not going to say wow. I'm going to say wow, 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 wow. Because each one of those immahos was so beautiful. I think we're all trying to see whether we can invite Dayan Hool to our Seder so that we can actually hear more of that, because it's absolutely beautiful. Can I just say that it really was inspiring tonight, and will be inspiring hopefully for the people that will hear this over from us as a conduit. Made such a big difference. We can hear lots of beautiful, however people do it, I don't know, but stickers and thank yous going on the group now, and we've all been seriously inspired. Can I just a bit of housekeeping? If I could ask everybody, please, who's on the share tonight, to please sign up on the chat. You'll see a way to sign up. It means that you can get a notice of the shiurim midei chodesh b'chodshei. And nothing else that will come on your WhatsApp group other than the share will be a reminder on the day and one before. And that's it. And if you could sign up, please take in the chat the sign up mark, and that will enable you to be able to have the shiurim directly without relying on any other source. So you know they will come. I can't promise they will all be on the standard of Dayan Hool or the most, but I can promise you that we'll try. Bez Hashem, we should also just think add off, obviously, to say that. Bez Hashem, Klal Yisrael should also have a Yeshua now, our current Yeshua that we've got in at the moment, and in the schus of such beautiful shiurim, Dayan Hool, and the schus of the Noshim Tzidkonius that you've mentioned, the Arba Mois, we should Bez Hashem that we should have Klal Yisrael should also bring Shalom at the moment, and be able to have a kosher Pesach with Meluchas HaNefesh for Gans Klal Yisrael in the whole world. Thank you again. All the best. Wishing everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank
and
you.
everyone should have a beautiful Yom Tov.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
well,
Shkaya. Bye-bye.